Good morning. Happy Thursday. Yesterday, everyone went ahead and submitted their slideshows. I hope that was the deadline. You've had plenty of time and feedback. You're getting 50 points for giving all of your comments, and I've been tallying that, logging it, and then you are getting out of 100 points your before and after. So this was before feedback, and then this is an after feedback. Um, for example, Maria has one here. This is before and after feedback. I must say that lighting is really important and shadows can be distracting. This one is a much clearer image, and this one has a glare and a shadow in it. So be very mindful when you take your pictures that you are putting these with perfect lighting. And if you're not, we need to figure out ways to fix that. So I would advise Maria to retake this shot. And to be honest with you, she changed the direction of the words, and here they were the other direction. I see that she has better handwriting, but I preferred the way the layout was of these words. And so I'm going to be talking to each and every one of you about, your work and what's working and what's not working, because I still think this one is stronger than this one. And so that's something that it looks like she can easily tweak and change and make the image stronger. So I will be having one-on-one conversations with you guys about that, but not in this recording. But this is just one example. I like to use students that I've had in other AP classes as examples because they're used to it. I'm not going to do that with the beginning kids so much, especially in a recording. Okay, so I'm going to go to the agenda for today. I noticed a lot of you had some dead center compositions, and that was a big issue. I put this art piece here because I thought it was a strong example of using one side or another, not putting the person in the dead center. That's kind of a way of explaining composition. You usually don't put the artwork dead center because it doesn't help the eye move around. And then another thing I really like about this cardboard rustic art piece is that it has fragments and it's sewn together, which gives it a much more interesting composition and textures. You can see lots of textures. The artwork has a full value range, which some of you are a little too light. You're afraid to get in there with the darks and the lights. You always want light next to dark for contrast, so it pops, and you want a full value range when you do any of your art pieces. So that's really important. Today we're going to talk about an overview of composition and the principles of design, what is dynamic art, and balance visually. So I'm going to go ahead and I always have a hard time opening these. My goodness. I'm going to pop this bad boy open. No.
Lead to a more aesthetically successful composition. We can also...
Let's start from the beginning. Is it going to play?
Grammarly does more than catch errors. With Grammarly, you can find
movies and films and...
The heck? How embarrassing. If it gives me the commercial again, I'm going to cry.
Composition is perhaps one of the most important aspects of art creation. Yet it's also one of those things that's often overlooked. Even if we get our proportions correct, we have a full range of value, and we've used the medium as a master, if our compositions are weak, then our artwork probably is as well. Thankfully, composition is one of those things that we can get right with a little bit of knowledge and planning. It doesn't require talent, and it definitely doesn't require guesswork. There are a few rules that we can keep in mind so that our compositions are strong every time. Hello everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to discuss composition. Clearly there's much more to art making other than just mark making. right? We need to consider composition as well, or the structure of the artwork that we create. Before we dive into composition a little bit further in terms of art, let's consider an analogy. If you're a musician, then you know that every song has a structure. A musical composer plans out the structure to the song, and each musician that plays the song has a specific part to play. If a musician plays the wrong part or plays the wrong notes, then the song becomes a real mess. The same thing's true for a piece of art. As artists, we need to structure and compose the pieces of art that we create. So we'll start our discussion of composition by taking a look at focal points. A focal point is the area or areas within the picture plane that command the viewer's attention. While we can have more than one focal point, we usually need to limit the focal points. One focal point is pretty easy to pull off. Two is a little bit more difficult. Any more than three is going to be really hard to pull off as an artist. So in most cases, we want to ensure that we have at least one focal point within the picture plane and maybe one or two supporting focal points as well. Now we can create focal points within a scene using 5 different techniques. The first technique is through contrast. Contrast deals with difference, and this can be any type of difference. It can be textural difference, it can be color difference, and it can be value difference. The list goes on and on. But any type of contrast is going to command attention from the viewer. Let's take a look at this image. In this image, we can see that the green tomato is the focal point. The reason why it's the focal point is because of contrast. The green contrasts the red around it. In fact, red and green are complementary colors. It provides a high level of contrast, thus commanding our attention and creating a focal point. Another way that we can create a focal point within the scene is through isolation. Now, if you ever got in trouble as a kid and were put in the corner, I don't think they do that anymore, then you know what isolation is all about. When you were put in the corner, if you were, then all the other kids in the classroom stared at you. You were isolated from the rest of the class and therefore demanded a lot of attention. We can do the same thing in our artworks by isolating certain elements. Let's take a look at this image. Here we can see that the coin that's by itself, closer to the viewer, is the focal point. Our eyes are naturally drawn to this coin because it's isolated from the rest of the coins behind it. This is an excellent way of creating a focal point in your compositions. Another way that we can create focal points in our compositions is through the placement on the paper. Naturally, we're drawn towards the center of specific shapes. If we take a look at this example by Van Gogh, we can see that he's placed the subject directly in the center of the picture plane, more specifically, the eyes of the subject directly in the picture plane. Naturally, this becomes the focal point within the scene. Now, while we can create a strong focal point by placing the subject directly in the center of the picture plane, it's not always best to do so. When we do so, we typically end up with a static composition. We can make the composition a little bit more dynamic by just placing the subject slightly off center, or better yet, along one of the thirds of the picture plane. But more on that in just a moment. Another way that we can create a focal point is through convergence. Now, convergence deals with the use of actual lines and shapes or implied lines and shapes that help to direct a viewer's eye to a specific location. We can take a look at how convergence works in this image. In this image, you're likely drawn to the small figure close to the center of the picture plane. You're drawn to this location because of converging lines that exist there. In this case, these converging lines deal with one-point perspective, and these lines are helping to pull the viewer's eye to that specific location. Therefore, the small figure within the picture plane becomes the focal point. Another way that we can create a focal point is through the use of the unusual. Anything that's unexpected or out of place, of course, is going to command our attention and also our viewers' attention to a specific location within the picture plane. Let's take a look at this image. Here we can see that the person who has the bug head clearly is unusual. And because of this, we're naturally drawn to that location. Therefore, even though we have several different people standing in line, the person with the bug head is commanding the attention and thus becomes the focal point. Now, although creating a strong focal point is incredibly important in creating a strong composition, it's not the only factor we should consider. Next, let's take a look at the principles of design and see how they influence our compositions. The principles of design deal with how the elements of art are arranged in a work of art. The elements of art, of course, are the basic building blocks for art creation. Generally, there are 8 accepted principles of design.
Do you want to learn to draw professional and impressive artwork from scratch that will blow people's minds?
Design. They are balance, proportion, movement, rhythm, harmony, unity, emphasis, and variety. Some art specialists also include contrast as one of the principles of art, but since contrast can create emphasis, most people decide to leave it off the list. Not all of the principles of art affect our compositions, but most of them do. Let's take a closer look at how the principles of design affect our compositions. We'll start with balance. In terms of art, balance refers to the overall distribution of visual weight within a composition. Each element or subject that we include in our compositions carries with it a visual weight. If we include one subject on one side of the picture plane, we'll likely need to counteract that visual weight with either negative space or another element that carries with it its own visual weight. Therefore, we can create visually balanced compositions. We can compare visual balance to a teeter-totter or a seesaw. Imagine we have one large object or a person on one side of the seesaw. The seesaw won't be balanced. But if we had a couple of medium-sized objects or people to the other side of the seesaw, we achieve an equilibrium. The seesaw is now balanced. If a work of art is not balanced visually, it may feel heavy. For example, if we include too many visual elements close to the bottom of the picture plane, it will pull a viewer's eye to that location, and the overall composition may feel unsettling. Take a look at this image. In this case, we have several visual subjects at the bottom of the picture plane. At this point, it feels very heavy. But if we counteract this visual weight with an element or two at the top of the composition, then it becomes more balanced. We should also be aware of how our images are cropped, as this can also create added visual weight. For example, if we place objects too close to the edge of the picture plane, it can pull a viewer's eye and create unwanted attention. If we take a look at this image, notice how the bird is positioned too close to the edge of the picture plane. The edge of the branch at the top is also too close to the left side of the picture plane. In this image now, there is enough space provided on both sides of the picture plane to provide a bit of balance, resulting in a more successful composition. The next principle to consider is movement. Now, in terms of art, movement can refer to actual physical movement, as in the case where we might have a person running in a scene, but it can also refer to the way a viewer's eye moves through the piece of art that we've created. In most cases, we are drawn into artworks and guided to the focal point or the area of most importance, and then supporting elements within the scene guide our eye throughout the piece of artwork. We want to engage our viewers, so we need to encourage them to move through the piece in a specific way, and a lot of times this is referred to as eye movement. Depending on the subject, the order in which someone may move through a piece of artwork may look like this. First, the viewer is drawn into the work. Then the viewer is guided to the focal point or focal points. Then the viewer is guided to supporting elements. Then the viewer is guided out of the work or back to the focal point. This visual movement within the composition is usually achieved using contrast, guiding lines, diagonals, or overlapping objects. Take a look at this painting by Willard Metcalf. Take note of how your eyes move through the work. Perhaps your eye followed a similar route as mine. I entered the work at the bottom of the valley near the stream. I was guided by the line of darker trees to the center of the pictorial space, then back into the forest on the left. I then followed the line of trees across just in front of the distant mountains. From there, I was guided back to the center. The positioning of these elements allowed me to engage in the artwork. I was able to move through the piece and enjoy each one of the individual sections of the artwork without becoming overwhelmed with visual information. We can do the same thing in our artworks. When we plan our compositions, we can consider how a viewer's eye may move through the piece. Now, of course, we don't have complete control over how viewers will interact with our art, but we can have some influence. The next principle to consider is rhythm. We understand rhythm through repetition. Take, for example, the beat of a song. We hear the beat and we understand its rhythm because it repeats, usually in a predictable way. The same is true for a piece of art. We create visual rhythm in a piece of art through repetition. Repetition helps to unify a piece of artwork, and it creates that rhythm that can lead to a strong composition. Let's take a look at this famous painting by Van Gogh. Notice how it has a sense of rhythm. This rhythm is created through repetition. We can see here how the shapes created for the blades of the flowers are repeated throughout the composition. And also the shapes for the smaller flowers in the upper left-hand corner. And then the shapes created for the irises are no different. They also repeat. A repeating element or subject within a piece of artwork is often referred to as a motif. So if we include a motif in our artworks, it helps to create that visual rhythm. By including visual rhythm, we also create a bit of harmony and unity, which leads us to our next principles to consider. Harmony and unity.
Wow, these videos are obnoxious. I'm so sorry.
Unity. Our compositions should clearly be harmonious and unified. Now, harmony and unity are very similar to each other, but they're slightly different. Unity deals with a feeling of oneness in a piece of artwork. If we want to create unity in our artwork, then we should use the medium in a consistent manner and bring it to a level of completeness so that the artwork feels complete. It's also important to consider artistic style. If we use a specific style in one location of the painting or drawing, we should continue this style throughout. This leads to a feeling of unity in a piece of artwork. Harmony more so deals with the individual parts of a piece of artwork and how they work together. We can consider harmony and unity in terms of a family. Let's consider a family in the traditional sense here for this analogy. A family is made up of different members. A family may have a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. Each family member is different and is their own unique person, but the family is still a unit. Some families get along well with each other, while others don't. Let's take a look at a composition that is harmonious and unified. In this case, we'll take a look at an example by Robert Harris. This work is unified and harmonious for a number of reasons. The most obvious way is through its use of color. Harris has simplified the color scheme and used mostly the complementary colors of red and green. The green is very earthy, but it's still there. This is an example of creating harmony and unity through simplification. In fact, there are several ways that we can create harmony and unity in our compositions. We can create harmony and unity in our compositions by using the medium in a consistent manner throughout the artwork, simplifying shapes, subjects, or color schemes, using a consistent style throughout the artwork, making sure the work appears finished, ensuring that each individual part of the piece works and makes sense with the other parts. Now let's discuss our next principle of design, emphasis. We typically use emphasis to create focal points within the scene, and we've already discussed several methods for creating focal points. You'll notice that each one of these methods, or most of them, rely on some form of contrast to pull a viewer's eye to those locations. Let's take a look at this work by Degas. Most of us are drawn to the woman in the scene, more specifically to her face. Degas has pulled our attention to her using several different methods. For starters, she's centrally located within the picture plane. There's also strong value contrast around her. Notice how the man next to her is dressed in black while she wears white. There's even a dark shadow cast on the wall right next to her light face. Then there's the lines of convergence created by the tables and the back edge of the bench. You'll also notice that the face of the woman has more details compared to the other elements within the scene. This also helps to pull a viewer's eye to that location. The next principle to consider is variety. Like emphasis, variety deals with contrast or difference, and we should include some variety in our artworks. Take, for example, your favorite food. Now, imagine what life would be like if you had to eat your favorite food for every meal for the rest of your life. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and nothing else, you're having your favorite food. The first day it might be great, but on the second day you might start to grow tired of your favorite food, and over time you probably start to hate it. We should approach our artworks in the same way. We shouldn't bore our viewers with the same thing over and over again throughout the artwork. We need to mix things up a little bit and have some variety. The key here is combining variety and harmony in a masterful way. If we have too much variety, then we might end up with a piece of artwork that's not harmonious. If we have too much harmony, we might end up with a piece of artwork that has or is lacking variety. Let's take a look at an example where the artist has balanced variety and harmony. In this work, Kandinsky has created variety by using a broad range of color, but kept the painting unified through simplification. Now, believe it or not, there's more to consider when it comes to composition outside of the design principles in creating strong focal points. There's a few other factors we should consider. Next, we'll discuss positive and negative space. Space is one of the 7 elements of art, and most of the times when we discuss space, we're discussing depth or the illusion of depth in a drawing or painting. When we're discussing composition, however, we can consider space in a slightly different way. We can consider the positive and negative space within the picture plane. Now, positive space generally refers to the areas within the scene where we have subjects or elements of importance. Negative space, on the other hand, are the areas or locations that surround these areas of importance or the elements within the scene. Positive doesn't necessarily mean good, and negative doesn't necessarily mean bad in this situation. Now, let's take a look at an example. Here we can see a photograph of an orchid on a plain white background. Now, let's isolate the positive and negative space so we can better understand its relationship within the composition. If we isolate the negative space, seen here highlighted by red, we can see that the negative space takes up the space around the orchid and in between the individual parts of the orchid. Now, if we isolate the positive space, we can see that the positive space in this image is taken up by the entire orchid, the stem, and even the pot. Positive and negative space work to frame the composition. We can have a composition that's made up of mostly positive space, an equal amount of positive and negative space, or mostly negative space. In this example, we can see that we've taken our subject and broken it down into a composition made up of mostly positive space. And here's an example of a composition made of equal parts of positive and negative space. And here's one made of mostly negative space. Each one of these compositions is derived from the same subject, and each one of these compositions could be considered successful. Now, finding a good balance between positive and negative space in your compositions will depend on a variety of factors, including the level of detail in the subject that you're including, the material that you use, the way that you're handling the material, and other visual factors. But the key to finding success with the balance between positive and negative space all relies on your planning, which leads us to the next aspect of creating strong compositions: planning. Planning is perhaps the most important aspect to finding success with our compositions. Unfortunately, planning is the step that most people skip completely. Take, for example, you're going on a road trip to a place you've never been before. You wouldn't just pack your bags, hop in the car, and take off. You most likely would do some form of planning. You might look at a map, or you might enter the address in your navigation system. Either way, you're doing some sort of planning. We need to approach our drawings and paintings in the same way. We need to have some idea of where we're going with the artworks that we create before we start creating them. Most times, we create small sketches ahead of time. These small sketches are usually referred to as thumbnails. Now, thumbnails are loose and quick. They're not meant to be finished pieces of artwork. They're just meant to help you figure out all the compositional puzzles before you actually go to your artwork. That way, when you're in your artwork and you're creating your drawing or painting, you've already decided on all of the design elements. Of course, you can change your mind along the way, but at least you have a really good idea of what you're trying to accomplish with the artwork that you create. And when we approach thumbnail sketching, we should do so with an attitude of experimentation. We should be open to any ideas that might enter our brains and quickly sketch them down. A lot of times we often think that our first idea is the best. But oftentimes, if we allow our mind to think creatively and we're open to experimentation and different possibilities, we may find that best idea on our 5th or 6th or even 10th attempt at creating a thumbnail sketch. So the next time you create a piece of artwork, make sure you do some planning. Sketch out your composition before you start into it. And more than likely, you'll create a stronger composition than you would have without any planning at all. The rule of thirds is another compositional strategy that we can take with our artworks. Now, the rule of thirds is based on a mathematical theory called the golden mean or the golden principle. The golden mean and golden principle is rather complex, so most artists and photographers simply refer to the rule of thirds when they're laying out specific subjects within a scene. The way the rule of thirds works is basically we take our picture plane and divide it into thirds, both horizontally and vertically. We have intersection points that happen along these thirds. These intersecting points are great places to put focal points. They often lead to a more aesthetically successful composition. We can also even place subjects directly on these lines of thirds. You'll see this used lots of times in different movies and films and even photographs. In fact, if you take a look at the video you're watching right now, you'll notice that I'm laid out in one of the thirds within the picture plane. Let's take a look at this work. Notice how the artist has positioned the figure, which is the focal point, almost directly on one of these points. Now, the compositions we create can be either static or dynamic. Static compositions are fairly straightforward and direct. Static compositions make sense for images like illustrations. For example, a scientific illustration where the intent is to basically show the viewer some information. In most cases, however, we want to create more dynamic compositions since those tend to be more interesting. There are several ways that we can create more dynamic compositions, but one way that's used by artists over and over again is by including diagonals in the artwork. In this work by Frederick Remington, we can see the repeating diagonals throughout the artwork. Notice how it makes the artwork more engaging and more interesting, more importantly, more dynamic. So look for interesting ways to incorporate diagonals in your composition. For example, instead of showing a subject from a straight-on view, maybe you consider showing that same subject from a bird's eye view or perhaps a worm's eye view. This will create more interesting angles and give you the opportunity to include more diagonals in your compositions. Now, when we compose our artworks, we should also consider the number of elements or subjects that we include. The human mind finds balance in odd numbers, more specifically the number 3. This means that including 3 objects is the optimal number of objects to include to find balance and create a more successful composition. This doesn't mean that you have to use 3 objects by any means. You're welcome to use more or less. It just means that if you're using more than 3, it's better to use 5 than 4, and it's better to use 7 than 6. For whatever reason, if we have 2 objects within the scene, it tends to make a sort of competition between the 2 objects, and it's hard for our minds to determine which one of the 2 objects is the focal point. For example, if we look at this image that features 2 spheres, it's hard to determine which one of the 2 spheres is the most important and therefore demands our attention. However, when we add a third, the other 2 subjects act to frame the third, resulting in a more balanced composition. So what have we learned here? Well, we've learned that composition is not about guesswork. It certainly has nothing to do with luck, and it's definitely not about talent. Composition is about understanding how your viewers will interact with what you create. It's the result of careful planning, and it also sometimes involves some experimentation. Now, we've covered a lot here, and it can be a bit overwhelming. But the more that you practice these concepts and incorporate them into your own compositions, the more they'll become intuitive to you, and your compositions will improve over time. If you enjoyed this video, then I know you'll love being a member at thevirtualinstructor.com. Our members have access.
Okay. So that again is just reiterating how important composition is. I don't know if you're aware of this, but as the video was playing, I'm commenting on your work and grading it. I sent back a lot of your work. I haven't finished everyone's, but the biggest issue that I've seen is the composition. And so this video went over each and every step of the composition. So I would recommend rearranging, having strong contrast, thinking about the rule of thirds, all those things. And I wish I had played this before we did this artistic mind map, but I just felt like we needed to hurry up and get to art making. And there's no reason why we can't readjust it now while it's very fresh and relevant in our heads. I think that, we are really on a good start with our ideas and the feedback and the critiquing. We've put in a lot of information. Did you guys find this video helpful? Poll question?
Yeah.
Poll question, yes or no?
Yeah. Mine doesn't work.
Who's saying that?
Janelle, my poll question, like when you do that, it
Yeah.
doesn't let me do it.
Okay, well, at least you said it verbally to me, so I know that you're here. Like, for example, I did the poll question and Sabin is not responding, so I'm going to go ahead and mark her absent. Let's see, who else is not responding? Graceland's not responding, so I guess she's absent too. Anthony Carrillo's not responding. When you guys are not paying attention, it definitely shows me. You're here, but you didn't respond. Are you sure you're really paying attention?
Yeah, my mic just didn't pick it up.
But you didn't respond to the poll question.
I'm here.
Oh, but you didn't respond to the poll question.
I was trying to look at your comment on the slide.
Oh, okay. I understand. At least I know you're alive. Okay. And then Sophia's not responding to the poll question. Therese is not responding, so I'll mark them absent. I'm tired of playing this game of like, oh, sure, I'm paying attention, but you're really not. That's why I can't stand it. So Sophia's absent, Therese is absent. Let's see who else. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move on. So now we have roughly 10 minutes. I had one more thing, and this is 4 minutes long that I wanted to go over with you all. Why is it not working? Come on.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Tavis Leaf Glover, and today we're just going to be simplifying dynamic symmetry and breaking it down to one line. A lot of people are confused with the dynamic symmetry grids because probably it's a little bit difficult to understand. Everybody wants to know where to place their subject, if they should put it in a certain crosshair or on the diagonal or something like that. The best thing to do is start with one diagonal, okay? And let's start with the Baroque diagonal. It doesn't matter what size of rectangle you have or if you're using a square or whatever. Every shape, every rectangle or square has a diagonal.
Oh my goodness, it's terrible. Why is it doing this? I guess I have shoddy Wi-Fi today. Okay. Man. I want you to watch this video on your own. It's on the agenda. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this video because it just doesn't seem like this is working.